Oh, here, I'll lead.
Okay.
Hi, we are the Gunther family, and this is a video log of the Gunther's life and times. I'm going to conduct interviews with Les and Betsy Gunther, as well as Eric asking questions, and Patrick Kirby, and hopefully Forrest Allison in some future segments.
And what's your name?
Oh, and I'm Gretchen Allison.
I'm Eric.
Okay, we can tell that. Okay.
Okay, Betsy?
Right. Yes. Well, I'd like to introduce Gretchen, who, with a full introduction. Daughter, Gretchen Mary Thayer Gunther Allison, and our son Eric Christian Gunther. Never had to change his name. Boys get lucky that way. And my name's Elizabeth Ann Edgerton Thayer Gunther, and these are all family names, and Les has a family name too.
Hmm?
That's your cue.
What's my family
What's your name? What's your whole name?
Lester Capel Gunther, Jr. Lester was my father. Capel was the maiden name of my paternal grandmother, and Junior because I follow my father's name.
Mm-hmm. And who are your parents? Can you give us your parents' name?
Yeah, my father's name was Lester Capel Gunther, Sr., and my mother's name was Blanche.
Wilson.
Yeah, Wilson, but she had some sort of strange
Zilpha.
middle name, Zilpha, I think it is. Yeah, it was Zilpha because
Zilpha.
my maternal grandmother read lots of romance novels. They had these strangely named women, and most of my aunts were named Ivorine and all sorts of odd first names in conjunction with these novels.
So where was Blanche from?
She was born in Portland, Oregon. Her parents, John T. Wilson, was Scottish descent, and he and his wife, my grandmother, whose name I don't remember particularly, they used to call her Hattie. They came from Canada, migrated to Portland. My grandfather had an auction house there, and that was his business. They also had a house up on Mount Tabor, which is now in the registry of historical houses in Portland. My mother was born in Portland, married my father about 1918, I think. After the war, he was discharged as a first lieutenant in Ordnance, U.S. Army, served overseas during World War I. He went to University of Pennsylvania, was the first student from west of the Mississippi to attend Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He graduated cum laude, and my mother went to the University of Oregon in Eugene until such time as she married my father, and she gave up her brilliant academic career to marry my father. They moved to Montclair, New Jersey. My father took a job with Carnation Milk, which was a Western company. They moved to New Jersey so that he could work in their office on Wall Street. Excuse me. And they lived there for many years. Then they went to Europe. They transferred to Europe to run the Carnation Milk business over there. It was called General Milk. it was a company that was mutually owned by Pet Milk and Carnation Milk, and they canned milk, which was very popular in Europe at that time because of the fact that there was a lot of tuberculosis in the regular raw cow's milk in France and the rest of Europe, so that the children were raised on canned milk, as I was. Because I was born in Paris in 1925 when they were over there, lived over there. We lived in Saint-Cloud, which is outside of Paris, and I attended the McJanet American School for 2 or 3 years. I don't remember how long, but I do remember Paris and Saint-Cloud and my early childhood quite vividly. We lived there until I was about 8, and then moved back to Montclair, New Jersey, as my father transferred back to Wall Street.
What was the house like in Paris?
Well, it was called a villa. It was on the Rue de Tenarol in St. Cloud. We went back, Betsy and I went back and saw it a number of years later, after I was in my 40s, I suspect. And what I remembered as a grand mansion had all of a sudden shrunk to an ordinary house. But for its time, it was a mansion or a villa. It had running water. It did not have flush toilets, and periodically the guys would come around and clean out the toilets. They were indoors, but they were chemical toilets. And I remember those people specifically because they were always roaring drunk when they showed up to do the job, which you can't really blame them. We had lived the life of expatriate Americans. My father was making a good salary, so we had cooks and maids and so on. I had a governess. My sister, Jean, who was born prior to the family going to Europe, she was born in Jersey City, and she had a lifelong annoyance because she was born in Jersey City and I was born in Paris, which is considerably more romantic. And but she stood up to it. Our life there was very well. My father commuted into Paris to his office every day, and I went to McJanet School, as did my sister. McJanet School was for foreign students in Paris. Among our classmates was the Mountbatten, who became the consort to Queen Elizabeth, Queen of England. Several Japanese from the royal family. While we were there, people came and talked to us. Amelia Earhart was one of them. Admiral Byrd was another. Those are the two that I remember quite clearly. I'm sure there were others that weren't as interesting to me. How long do you want me to go on?
No, it's all fascinating.
Yeah. So, in any event, prior to the war, Germany was beginning to make noises, and so we moved back to the United States. My father continued to have an office in Paris, but he too, his main office was then moved to Wall Street, New York City.
I hadn't realized that the Germany gearing up for war was the reason you moved back.
It was part of the reason. It wasn't at the time. The Spanish Civil War was going on, and Europe was beginning to get in turmoil. The Germans and the Italians were siding, of course, with the Phalangists, with Franco, who were the people staging the revolution, against the Loyalists, who were backed by Russia and communists. The Loyalists were quite far left, though I think they probably had lots of communists in their ranks, but basically they were much more Democrats. And the Germans, of course, were fascists. The war was going on there. The United States was allowing volunteers to go over and fight with the Loyalists. And things were in well, I can remember one Bastille Day. I think it was Bastille Day. It was the 4th of July. So one of the holidays. Jean, my sister, was picked to lay the wreath on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is now in Triomphe in Paris. I went along, of course, with my parents, and while she did this, and that day I can remember the gendarmes, the police in Paris, fighting the communists who were staging riots. The police were on their horses and hitting the rioters. Europe was in a turmoil. It had gone through Germany had gone through a depression which made our depression, which was going on at the same time, look like a prosperous endeavor. And probably was one of the reasons that the Nazis came into power, because things were in really chaotic condition. But in any event, it was not affecting me a great deal. My father was affected by the depression. He developed a peptic ulcer, or duodenal ulcer, I should say, and collapsed. And he's told me that when he was on the operating table, he thought, well, it's depression, I've lost everything I have. And he said he was pretty well wiped out. And I have a wife and 2 children, I can't die. And he thought that helped him through the ordeal. You have to remember that this was probably 1930 about, and surgical procedures were far less, more dangerous than they are now. Medicine has advanced hugely since that time. But so he was in bad condition, but he thinks that thinking helped him through, which it did, fortunately for all of us. When we returned to the States, we lived in the Marlborough Inn for about a year, which is a residence hotel in Upper Montclair. Then my parents bought a house on Upper Mountain Avenue in Upper Montclair. Lovely place, big white colonial with, I could guess it had 3 or 4, at least 4 bedrooms, and maids' quarters upstairs and a big basement and so on.
Before you moved from France, did you have a governess? What was her name?
Yeah, I had a governess I had 2 governesses. I had one who was an English lady. Her name was, oh boy, I can't. Anyway, she was an English governess, typical English governess, who was devoted to me, to the place where she was rather, well, I would say neurotic. She threatened to run away and kidnap me and take me. Of course, I was a baby at the time.
Nurse Vernon?
Nurse Vernon.
Nurse Vernon,
Yeah.
that's right, Nurse Vernon. And my father fired her and hired a woman by the name of Janine, who was my governess over there.
Nurse Vernon said to your mother that she was going to take you.
Yeah, run away with me or something.
And she kept the baby book,
Oh yeah.
a silk baby book. I
Yeah.
think we still have.
Oh.
And in it is her saying baby's first haircut was given by Nurse Vernon while his mother was out.
But anyway, Nurse Vernon went. I have no idea whatever happened to her. But Janine, my governess, later with her husband Raymond, after World War II, came and worked for my parents in California. But I'm getting ahead of the story. See, where did I drop off?
Sorry, you had a White House in.
Yeah, White House.
Jersey.
Yeah. And so I went to, entered Mount Hebron School in Upper Montclair, which was a public school. And unfortunately, my mother had not noticed that the kids in the States were wearing knickers that were drooping down to their ankles and wearing Keds, kind of the high toppers with the red insignia on the side, the first authentic Keds. And she dressed me in little Fauntleroy type clothes, short velvet pants, shirts with little bow ties and that sort of thing. It didn't last long.
Into the New Jersey public schools
Yeah.
descends Little Lord Fauntleroy.
Yeah, what was shredded off my body was thrown away. And anyway, I went to Mount Hebron, learned gutter English very rapidly, and my native French was forgotten.
Did your father teach you to hit back?
Yeah, my father decided, my father was always for free enterprise, and he decided that the best way for me to protect myself was to pay me. So he gave me a dime for every fight I got into, and a quarter for any one that I won. Well, of course, I always told him I won, but yeah. So I was a professional pugilist at a very early age.
Mom tells the story. Is it apocryphal that the first words you learned when faced with all these New Jersey bullies was "me American boy"?
Yeah, me American boy, and I worked on it very hard. Betsy, you want to add?
Oh, Eric can get that.
As I talk, more and more comes up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. How did it shrank?
Well, you can't really chew while you're talking, so you have to have just enough to.
I noticed you're not having any trouble talking while you're chewing.
That's all part of the direction and choreography.
I'm hogging the limelight here. Where were we? I was in Montclair, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
You have some crumbs.
You want to
Okay.
get back?
Have crumbs?
Talk about
Usually that's my beard.
earlier.
That's why I grow the beard. Siphon my food through it. But I want to go back to Jean, who was my sister. She was the one that was born in Jersey City, the only one I had. She moved she moved to Montclair with the rest of the family. Went to Kimberly, which was a young ladies preparatory school for college. She finally went to Pine Manor, which was a young ladies finishing school, and 2 years there, and that was the extent of her education. She eventually married a man by the name of Johnson, who was of the Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical family. Divorced him and eventually married Albert Hemphill,
I didn't know she
who
had
was a lieutenant, Al, or Bert, as he was called. Graduated from Lehigh as an engineer, went into the service during World War II, served as a first lieutenant in the Aleutians, and actually just before the war ended, Jean married Bert. They had 3 boys, and she lived in Portland most of her subsequent life. Died just this year, 2008.
Bert had MS for
Yeah.
the latter half of their lives.
Yeah, at least the half of his life he had
Mhm.
multiple
He lived a long
sclerosis.
time with that disease,
Yeah.
much longer
Yeah.
than people
Yeah.
usually do.
Yeah. He was
He
a
did.
nice guy and
Nice guy.
never achieved great accomplishments, but was a very steady father and provider. He was a good man, really good man.
Do you know what he did in the Aleutians?
No, I don't. I don't know what he did.
Army or?
He was Army, yeah. I think ROTC when he was at Lehigh. Okay, and then to go back to France, you wanted to hear more about
Yeah.
France, conditions in France. Well, I can remember that I was riding in a baby carriage, and Jean, my sister, who was annoyed with me, tipped over the baby carriage, and I cut my head, and she was very proud of it. She remembered it to her death, remembered having done that, so it must have been deserved. We had a dog called Tout Petit, which is too small in French, translates. And it was a black and tan terrier with great ambitions, sexual ambitions, because almost the entire neighborhood was covered with little black and tan terriers. And if there was a female dog anywhere within the area who was ready, Tupi would go over the wall which surrounded our place, which was incidentally embedded with broken glass on the top. It wouldn't mean nothing to him. It was a dog of strong passions. Except when we'd go, they had a farmer's market every day in St. Cloud. There was a farmer's market where everybody went to buy their produce and everything else. I can remember the rabbits, dead rabbits hanging by their legs, and the live chickens and so on. People go down and buy these things, and if they were alive, they'd kill them. And you know, it was a good French farmer's market. But as we'd walk down Rue de Tenarol to the farmer's market, there was a bistro that had a very large black dog and a fence in front of it, and actually to the side, and the fence was slightly elevated, so there was just a little space behind or at the bottom. And Tupi, when he'd walk down with us, would if the dog was behind the fence, would bark and snarl and run along the bottom of the fence. But if the dog was out sitting in front with people who were drinking, Tupi was always on the other side of the street and would hide behind the baby carriage as we'd go down. Pretty smart dog. Yeah, I can remember lots of things about France, but they're very superficial.
How did you get to school?
I drove. My father would drive into town. We had the man who finally married my governess, Raymond, was our chauffeur. We had a Talbot, which is a Talbot, a French car, and we would every day drive. He would drive into town, take me along, drop me off with Janet's school on the way. But the Talbot was, especially in winter, was very difficult to start, and when it did start, it caught fire. So
Every time?
yeah, every time. So I can remember we'd go to the garage, and Raymond would raise the hood, stand there with a blanket, My father would get in the talbow and start it. And when it caught fire, Raymond would throw the blanket over the fire to smother it. And we'd keep the talbow going, and everybody'd get in and we'd head for Paris.
That was electric start.
Yeah. And I remember running across the, hiding when the damn thing, because I was afraid of the explosion or potential explosion.
Were there still a lot of horse and buggy in Paris yet?
Yeah. And Paris was a much smaller place than it is today. My mother belonged to the American Women's Club, which is a wonderful Art Deco building. I remember to this day the parties that they had, and my trying to look up ladies' skirts, things like that. It was somewhat precocious.
Before you leave the talbow, tell
Mhm.
about the way the doors opened from the inside.
Oh yeah, they had what they call suicide doors today. In other words, most doors in cars will open.
It was like a link.
Yeah,
Continental.
instead of opening this way, they opened this way. In the talbow, they opened this way, and they had a cord in order to open the door. There was a cord across the door, and you just leaned on the cord, and the door opened. So we were going down the Champs-Élysées one day, and when I was quite young, my father was driving. I was sitting in the seat next to him, and I leaned on the cord, and the door flew open, and I started going out. He grabbed me by an ankle before I fell out onto the pavement and hauled me back in again, which is fortuitous for me.
Mm-hmm.
He paid for that
Always.
later on because I was a bad kid. But yeah, in France, in Christmas, I have to say that at that age, the department stores in France were, and I understand they still are, just absolutely magnificent. They'd go to almost no ends in decorations, and I can remember going into the toy the departments of these wonderful stores, and they'd set up the electric trains that would be running all over. There's wonderful toys. And Christmas in Paris was spectacular. My parents would have Christmas dinner, and many of the expatriate Americans were invited, and we always had turkey, and it was a real event for those that attended. It was the same people every year. It was a ritual. My sister and I we had a stairway up and a banister at the top, and we'd hide behind the banister and see the guests come in and look at the presents and so on. It was a very festive time. My parents belonged to the Faucu Golf Club in Saint-Germain, and I can remember going out there when my parents were playing golf, and I was very small. We still have 2 plates, commemorative plates from the golf club, still there. Very pretty place, done in, I would guess, all the French style of Richelieu's time. Hard to describe, half timbered, so on. My parents' favorite golf partners were Jim and Agnes Harding. Jim was a dentist over there, and Agnes. How bawdy can I get with this?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Agnes had a great sense of humor, and one of the things that I can remember my parents saying is that once when Jim was out relieving himself in the bushes on the golf course, Agnes yelled across, more than 2 shakes and you're playing with yourself. So the body humor, it was then the same as it is now.
Did they speak mostly French, or
No, they
English?
spoke English. They were Americans, and they spoke English, but they all spoke French. fluently.
How is it that you spoke only French?
Because I was with I spoke English with my parents, but I spoke French to everybody else.
Because
They spoke French and they didn't
the
understand
help
English.
was
Yeah, the help
French.
was French.
French speaking.
So you spoke some English before you came.
Oh
before you
yeah,
moved to America.
but with an accent, and the staff there was multinational. Our cook was a just gorgeous, wonderful cook, named Janka, and she was Polish. She had a boyfriend, and I don't know any of the details on this, except that he used to show up with buckets. I mean, literally, the hand buckets of frogs' legs. And we'd eat frogs' legs until they popped out of our ears. I love them. I love them. And it took a lot of frogs to make a bucket of frogs' legs. Let's see. I had a friend, Bobby Clark, who was my best friend over there. He was killed during the war. But we weren't really affected by the political strife that was taking place. We were pretty sheltered when we came back to the States.
Was your schoolwork in English?
Some of it, yeah. It was an American school. Yeah, it's mostly in English, but my daily life was in French. And it's peculiar that I've forgotten my French. I have a fine accent and so on, but I don't. My vocabulary is quite limited now. But I think it's been postulated that the reason for that is that when I came back, I had to fight my way against the kids who were naturally cruel, and as kids are, would tease anything unusual, and that was quite unusual. So to compensate for that, I just wiped out my French. The psychiatrist friend of ours, when I asked him to put me under hypnosis so I could recall my French, he suggested that it would be far better if I just got a mistress who didn't speak English. However, I did meet some resistance on that one.
Some people just aren't into good health.
Hmm?
Some people are just opposed to good medical treatment.
Yes.
What has come up as a question in your mind so far?
Well, I'm sure we'll think of more questions about that time. I was thinking maybe this would be a good time to go on to Mom's.
Yes.
So this is what year when you moved to the U.S.?
Well, I can remember, Eric, that it was Roosevelt had just been elected. So that would be about 1932.
So that's a year before Mom is born.
Yeah.
And the Depression is in full swing.
Oh, yeah. In the States, we had WPA.
What's that?
It was a
Work.
government
Works
program, Works
Project.
program, Works Project Administration.
Authority or administration?
Yeah, administration, I believe. And it was a make-work program to put people back to work, and the government would pay them.
Mm-hmm.
And primarily doing street work and that sort of thing.
And bridges? They
Yeah,
did
well,
stonework?
yeah.
All the
That
national
sounds
park
familiar.
buildings.
They
Yeah.
built Timberline Lodge
and
and wove. They had people weaving the draperies and making the furniture that went into it. And
yeah, it was quite a program. It got a bad name because those who were working in the streets usually were leaning on a shovel, and there was the joke then that nobody in the WPA worked, but they did a lot of stuff. They put people to work doing things like building ship models for museums, doing paintings for public buildings, all sorts of things.
All the national park buildings.
Yeah.
How
And
does
Coit
the
Tower.
CCC
Coit
fit
Tower's
into that?
paintings, I think, on the
Yeah.
inside were
I think it was
WPA.
youth.
They also had the CCC, which was a Conservation Corps.
Civilian.
Conservation Corps.
Yeah, and they take young guys and send them out in the woods to do clearing and so on. It was a good program. They ought to, today, now that we're back in a deep recession, go back and see how successful those programs really were. You have to also remember that at that time, politically, what was considered then left today would be considered quite far right. The political situation or character in this country has gone much farther to the left than most people realize. In those days, it was basically a very conservative political.
Not a lot of safety nets for people.
No,
And
none.
When the bottom dropped out.
None.
And then there was a depression before that depression, wasn't there?
Well,
I
there
guess
was
that
one in the
sort of-
late 1800s.
Uh-huh.
I think
We don't talk about much.
1901, 1902. It was a big one.
Yeah.
It was a big one. No, but we didn't have Social Security. Didn't have any unemployment insurance. It was a tough world.
Was if you had your money in a bank and there was a run on the bank, could
You lost your money.
You lost your money
Yeah.
because people would line up and take
Mhm.
out their cash, and if there wasn't any more cash.
First come, first served.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, and the Depression was a tough time. It wasn't for me because my father was making good money and we were living a good life. But there are a lot of people who really suffered during that Depression, and I think it may be about to happen again. Except that we do have more economic safety nets than we have.
Speaking of safety nets, you mentioned your dad's ulcer and it had to be operated on in Paris,
Mm-hmm.
and you drew a picture of the operation.
Oh yeah, but it was not very accurate because it had the germ flying over the top of the incision, and of course the remember and
Yeah, that drawing, we should have that
Yeah.
drawing still.
yeah,
And it showed the blood that Jim gave
hmm
your dad directly,
yeah.
arm to arm.
That's what they did in those days. There wasn't any serum.
No typing.
No blood banks or
typing.
anything. No.
Yeah.
Just,
It was just a
put it in
friend
here
across
and
the street.
put it there and
Wow.
turn the spigot. Yeah, times have changed, guys. It's been an amazing change in politics and sciences. Everything has changed hugely, except the human nature. That's still the same, but everything else is different.
So antibiotics weren't around when you were kids? were they?
No. I didn't see anything like penicillin until after World War II. We saw sulfas during the war. And that was every wound got sulfa, which was a big deal because it cut out the infections.
Mhm.
But yeah, my father flew in a Blériot, which was a kind of a kite with an engine.
In the war you did? In
No,
World War I?
no. It was after the war, and I don't remember the circumstances, but I remember that he did fly in a Blériot, and then he almost flew in the SST. He died. He had an opportunity to fly in the supersonic, the Concorde,
The Concorde.
but for
He and I were in France. We'd gone over on the QE2.
mhm.
And he'd taken me for a trip there, and we were going to come back on the Concorde. The two very opposite ways of getting to Europe and back. And we were going to go over to England and get the Concorde back, but he had had cancer, and it reoccurred when we were in southern France, and so he wanted to come straight home. So we went up to Paris and flew back instead. You know,
Flew
from
back
there,
in
but not in the,
regular commercial.
not in the Concorde. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to know more about Lester Sr.'s time in World War I. He was in the trenches, right? And he was
Yeah,
a
he was
message
well.
carrier?
Yeah, he was in ordnance. Ordnance being guns, artillery, bombs, all that sort of thing. Yeah, they were up. He spent time in the trenches because that's where they brought the armaments to rearm the soldiers, to resupply. Yeah, he said it was trench warfare was no fun. They'd run out of meat or food, and they'd kill the rats and eat the rats. It was muddy, it was wet, cold. The carnage was universal. It was terrible. And
What town or areas was he in?
it was up in the Somme, up in the northern areas. You know, that whole area of northern France was literally in the battle area. And he joined the 1st American Legion post, which is post number 1 in Paris. And it was post number 1 internationally, but the first one was established in Paris, and he joined it. And it's no longer there. Betsy and I were back in Paris some time ago, and we checked on it, and it's no longer there. It's been disbanded. But he was very disappointed because the American Legion conventions were usually held in Paris, and he said that he felt that many of the legionnaires who came over there had never seen battle or never been overseas, but they came over to Paris and behaved very badly, and were raucous and rowdy and destructive, and really put the Parisians off. Whereas before, the Americans were highly respected in Paris. And it's my own feeling that, or suspicion, that behavior gave us such a bad reputation. That's one of the reasons that the Parisians are known, or thought to be impolite and dislike Americans, a holdover from those times when the Americans were coming over and being really the ugly Americans. But it may not be. It's a long time ago now. But evidently we didn't behave very well.
So, Betsy, you were born in 1933?
33.
And that again was right at the height of the Depression.
It was.
And your father was a doctor?
Doctor,
general-
physician and surgeon,
Mhm.
general practitioner, babies and splinters and setting bones, and yeah. He was, had a practice. He joined a practice in Portland, Oregon. He was invited out, and I don't know what became of that, but they stayed in Portland. He married my mother, Dorothy Lida Root.
And where was he from?
And Dad was from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We have a painting of the house. And he was the next to the youngest of the children in the family, and the only one who was still living, whom I knew, was his sister Mary. and I visited her back east, and she came out and visited us
Mm-hmm.
in Portland.
What happened to the other siblings?
They died. My grandfather was a professor of English, and every time they would move to a new area in the east, they would leave a child in the graveyard there. It was very hard to keep youngsters alive. They were susceptible to diseases that now we have antibiotics for and cures
Was it
for.
mostly tuberculosis, or was it all different?
One tuberculosis, another
Flu epidemic.
Oh.
Yeah.
Was that the 1918 flu epidemic?
Yes.
Yes, it would have been.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And then Aunt Mary died in great pain, and it was never, no one was able to diagnose it correctly. She even came out to Portland and hoped that, Dad hoped that he could help her, and
Mm-hmm.
he couldn't. And so we don't know the cause of death. She had no children, so we had no cousins. My parents had 3 children. My older sister was born in 1925, and Mother and and Dad's sister talked about what the name should be, and they came up with Carol because she was born at Christmas season.
Mhm.
Oh, nice.
And
I know it.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe I should interject that Eric was named Eric Christian Gunther because we had expected Gretchen instead of Eric. In those days, we didn't have amniocentesis.
Ultrasound and uh-huh.
Yeah.
So we didn't know that so we thought it was going to be female.
Yes.
So we sat in the Mount Sinai Hospital in
Mount Zion.
Mount
Mount
Zion.
Zion.
Yeah, Mount Zion in San Francisco. And the nurses kept saying, "What are you going to call this thing?" We hadn't made up our minds. Finally, we called it Eric because Betsy didn't want to make it Lester the Third, which I agreed. So we call it Eric, and then
It.
and
Sorry about that.
And then
I had a dress for you I'd made and everything.
oh, yeah. So it was Eric.
Why
and-
were you so convinced it was going to be a girl?
I don't know. Just
Well,
intuition.
he had an older
as usual.
sister.
And you had
And
sisters.
I had an
Hmm.
older sister. I don't know. It was just
We just thought it was going to
An
be
assumption.
Gretchen. Turned out to be Eric, and his middle name is Christian because he was born in a Jewish hospital. And Gunther, he just came legitimately by. So
the legend over the door of the hospital was like the cypress in Mount Zion, I am exalted.
yeah.
Oh, nice.
And then you
Yeah.
said that to the surgeon after the
During the delivery.
During the delivery, and he didn't get it.
No, he didn't. He was attended by several medical students. Nobody asked me. But I was an example or a teaching tool.
I was having a hamburger down in the cafeteria when Eric was born. So, yeah, I was really worried.
Did you have cousins on the other side? Did you on your mother's side?
Yes, yes. And they lived back east. One of them, yeah, I've met them a couple of times, but it wasn't an era of going back and forth. But one of the cousins, Dorothy Hamilton Setterberg, even lived with us for quite a while when I was a child. And she had come out from the East Coast and went to Reed College. And the first day at Reed College, which was just a few blocks from us on 34th in Portland, she and Gordon met the first day of college, and that was it. And so they finished up and were graduated and married and lived in Portland, near it. And she was like a fourth daughter to Mother, and she stayed there because I went to college and married and left, and Carol left, and my little sister, Mary Melissa Jane, left Portland. So Dottie was the nice link, her being a child, being a friend too, because they both worked at Reed College. Mother worked because the house was so empty with the three of us gone, and Dad working, that she took a job at Reed and was in the admittance office for several years. Yeah.
How come she didn't go back into chemistry, do you think? Maybe that's just
I
what was
never-
available.
Yeah, I'd never heard of her doing anything more with that after they married, when they met in Lynch, Kentucky, I think it was, where they had independently gone for their first jobs. After school.
Bill
Yeah.
was I think it was Tennessee. I'm not, it was West Virginia, but he was in the doctor and for a company doctor for, I think it was a coal
Mhm.
company.
Mining town.
And they had
Mhm.
a mining town, and that was his first job, was as a doctor in that town. I remember his talking about, because it's such a problem now, everybody talks about narcotics, but her father saying that when he was the young doctor, the narcotics were readily available, and there wasn't any law against
Yeah.
them.
I remember his telling me about it, and the little child would come to him. No, the little child would go to
The druggist.
the drugstore
Yeah.
and put a
Nickel
up on the counter and say, "Mommy wants her powders," and the druggist would put a piece of paper there and put cocaine on it and fold it up in a little packet,
Mm-hmm.
and the child would take it home to Mommy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we didn't have drug czars, we didn't have anti-drug czars, we didn't have 65% of our population in jail, because, or 65% of the jail population in on drugs. All these things didn't happen because it was cheap, it was legal.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's expensive and illegal, and we've got all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
We don't learn very well.
So he, I remember you telling stories about Bill Thayer taking trade during the Depression for doctoring work. Do you
Mhm.
remember some of the things that he would accept in trade?
Yes, I remember meat in the refrigerator, and probably from hunters whom he knew. And there were always bags of walnuts and other nuts in the cold cupboard above the refrigerator in the Portland house. And I found out quite late that they were in trade for the medical attention that he was able to give them. He charged $5 for a house call quite a bit later on. And
The needlepoint?
and he was, yes, like the needlepoint piece in the dining room here was something that he was given by Auntie Toots, who was a woman who lived several blocks away from us, and he was her physician. And he didn't tell us who his patients were, except that we did know about Auntie Toots, because she said, when he came to call on her, she said, "Doc, what do you want?" He didn't know what she meant. She said, "Well, I want to give you something, and these things, I want you to take something." And he demurred, and she talked him into it. And the needlepoint in the frame was one of the pieces that she gave him, and also a big mirror that later hung over our
Chef room.
dining. No, it was over the when we were still in
Oh,
Portland. Yeah, over the mantelpiece and the fireplace. The fireplace in front of which you and I were married,
Mm-hmm.
and earlier on Carol had married John Cole in that same place. And yeah.
When you speak, you have to speak louder 'cause you're behind the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, Dad was often gone. Because he was out on calls. Mother would make dinner, and as often as not, we children and Mother would have dinner at the table, and then Dad would come home later and have his dinner, which was held over in the warm oven. So he got a lot of overdone food.
What was the cooking fuel being used? Was it an electric stove or a gas stove?
Yeah, an
or
electric.
wood?
Electric stove. Yeah, there was no gas that I was aware of. The furnace that heated the house was coal furnace, and a young man would come and shovel the coal out of the big bin into which the coal had been poured out of a truck, and he would load the furnace with coal, and then when the coals had burned down and the fire was cold, he or somebody else would come back and shovel out the clinkers, the unused residue of the coal. I don't remember what they did with that, but there was a special back set of stairs, concrete stairs, that went from the backyard down into the basement door.
I remember those stairs.
Do
yeah.
you?
Mhm.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And when did you get Nesco, and when was that property purchased?
That was in the late 40s.
To have a family
Mid
vacation
40s,
spot?
to have a vacation place. Because during the war, he was so busy because he was one of the small number of doctors who were left in Portland. And he was also doing work for the Army by doing physicals to see if the young men were able to go to war. And so he needed a place to get away because he was delivering babies and taking care of illnesses and doing this for the government. They looked for a place to go, and we bought a farm. They bought a farm out in Molalla, Oregon, on the town of Molino. I don't think we ever went out there with you. It's become quite suburban, probably. But it was 20 acres or so on a bluff overlooking the Molalla River, and there were horses. There, neighbor's horse that Mary Melissa rode when she was 3.5 years old. Great, lumbering, gentle, dapple gray horse of from the neighboring farm.
Well, that set a pattern, didn't it?
It
She still loves
really
horses.
did. Yeah, I'll bet that was instrumental. I know it was her first horseback riding, and she'd call it galloping, but the horse would go boom, 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 and back and forth in front of the farmhouse that my folks had bought, so they could get away.
During the Depression, how much of Granddad's doctoring went uncompensated? How much of that was just basic goodness on his part, where he would administer to people who he knew could never afford to pay him back, do you think?
Something my folks never mentioned was money. Just once in a while I would catch something like, oh, that's so-and-so walnuts up there. Not a name, but that's a patient's walnuts. They didn't have the money to pay or something. So I suspect that he did quite a bit. I think I remember my mother once overhearing her say something, "You ought to charge more." But it wasn't something that we children were privy to. They didn't talk about money and they didn't talk about God. They were just two subjects that were of no interest. Or it was such of important interest that they didn't mention it either. It was either something that ranked very inconsequential, or else it has such great consequences that it wasn't safe to talk about it.
He was the last doctor in Portland to charge $5 for a house call.
Shows good character.
He
Yeah.
also chose to opt out of Social Security, didn't he? When that
Yes.
when that was instituted, because he felt that he should be self-reliant, and if he can't, it's it's not the government's job to extend him charity.
That's right, yeah. But he wasn't going to take government money, and he kept up with that. He had some little booklets here, I may have one, about the evils of Social Security.
So did he never get a Social Security number then?
No, he didn't.
Mm-mm.
But that was one reason my mother went to work. She was the financier in the family. And when we children had gone to college, she went to work at Reed College, partly because it offered Social Security.
Oh.
And she was looking forward to their needing it. And indeed, I think they did accept the government money later on. At least she did in their name. Yeah.
But she died at what age?
I think she was 72.
72. So she had at most 7 years to accept the Social Security.
And she died in 72. She was born in 1899, so she was always, the year was of her age was the same as the year of the century. Yeah.
Let's